Today we're in the middle of our discussion on Aristotle. We're going to go back, we're going to look at Book 3 and the first part of Book 4 today from the Politics. And then when we come back next time, we'll finish up with the Politics. We'll look at Aristotle's construction of what he calls the perfect state. We may actually get into that a bit today if we have time. Let me remind you what we discussed last time. Let me remind you of some of the key themes that we looked at last time. We saw that Aristotle's book is quite distinct from its predecessor, Plato's Republic, if for no other reason than Aristotle specifically characterizes his work as what one might call a pragmatic inquiry. There's a kind of Aristotelian pragmatism to this exercise. So whereas the Republic was a kind of thought exercise to explore this question of justice, Aristotle is much more specifically concerned with politics in and of itself. It's not an expediency to try and find some deeper truth, as was the case in the Republic. Let me read from you, in fact, what he says about this idea of the pragmatic approach to politics, because it's at the beginning of Book 4. He says, "In all arts and sciences which embrace the whole of any subject and do not come into being in a fragmentary way, it is the province of a single art or science to consider all that appertains to a single subject." And he gives the example of gymnastics, for instance, a good Greek hobby. He says, "Hence it is obvious that government, too, is the subject of a single science, which has to consider what government is best and what sort it must be to be most in accordance with our aspirations if there were no external impediment. And also what kind of government is adapted to particular states. For the best is often unattainable, and therefore the true legislator and statesman ought to be acquainted not only with that which is best in the abstract, but also with that which is best relative to circumstances." So it's not only thinking about government in a kind of utopian way, but also in terms of what can we actually achieve given where we are. And so for this reason, Aristotle then locates his discussion of the politics not, as with Plato, as a kind of utopian thought experiment, but instead as a kind of review of politics as he sees it practiced around him. And as a result, we find suffused throughout the text frequent reference to examples from actual states, typically Greek city-states, that practice certain forms of government, upon which he then provides commentary. And the purpose of that is to reinforce this idea of the pragmatics of politics. The reason why for Aristotle that matters, we are political animals, therefore what do we do simply by virtue of being alive? What do we practice? Politics, right? Politics suffuses our life. Everything we do, all the relationships that we have are defined by the kinds of politics that we practice. And you may recall that in this sense we have a kind of redefinition of politics away from what we might otherwise think of it. It's not politics as it invests power in a state. Politics is a question of how we ourselves exercise power in our relationships. And you may recall that he has this rather interesting idea in the first book in which he says, although the state is composed of man, nonetheless, the state comes before the individual. So although the state is made up of individuals, it comes before the individual. And the reason for that is that in order for the individual to realize her own attainment, she must therefore find herself in some kind of a society, some kind of a political relationship, because we are not by ourselves self-sufficient. As he says, those who are not in a state are either beast or a god. But in order to be a person, therefore, you have to embrace this part of your politics. What made us political animals? Do you recall what was the feature, the characteristic of the human being that makes us political by nature? Our capacity for logos, for persuasive speech, capacity to shape our speech in a way that we can persuade others. And as he notes again in Book 1, this allows us then to construct, through the relationships that we have, principles such as what is just or what is unjust, what is expedient versus inexpedient, what's the right thing to do versus the wrong thing to do. And so we have this capacity for speech that persuades, and as a result of that capacity for persuasive speech, it makes us political by nature. Do all people have the capacity for persuasive speech, according to Aristotle? Who does not have that capacity? Slaves, right? There are some who by their nature do not possess the capacity for persuasive speech. Therefore, are they political animals? Yes, they are. Why are they political animals?
Because they can see in other people.
Exactly. They can recognize it in others. Even if you're too dumb to think for yourself, you can recognize the people around you who are smart enough to do the thinking for you. And so therefore, we see that Aristotle constructs in this initial discussion a set of relationships, basic relationships, that he then will later on in the text refer back to, but that capture these different kinds of political relationships, political connections. The master-slave relationship is characterized by an unequal distribution of logos, where the master speaks and the slave obeys. So this idea of a kind of unilateral or unidirectional relationship characterized by the unequal, or in this case, one-sided distribution of the capacity for persuasive speech. We also, you recall in that discussion, he talked about politics in the family, and he considered, for example, the relationship of a husband to his wife. Does a woman have logos? Yes, she does. What does she lack? Authority. So she doesn't have the authority to allow the persuasive speech that she has actually to take any kind of meaningful or concrete form. Nonetheless, because she has logos, therefore she is not a slave to her husband, but instead the relationship that governs the two is that between ruler and ruled, where both are capable of logos, but the ruler has a greater degree of excellence, as Aristotle would probably put it. And so what is the role of the woman in that relationship? To guide the rules under which she lives, and once the rules are set, what should she do? Talk a lot about it? No. You may recall, what's his phrase?
Silence.
A woman's glory, exactly. Silence is a woman's glory. She is expected to be silent and obedient. And then finally we saw the relationship of a child to a father, in which Aristotle describes it as a quasi-monarchical relationship, but unlike the slave, which is governed by an absence of logos, the monarchical relationship between a child and his father or his mother, based on what he calls respect due to age. Circumstance of life that a child finds him or herself in requires then that she respect her parent. But it holds out for the possibility that, of course, as they get older, they will acquire the logos themselves. I want to mention that there is something important to the Aristotelian way of inquiry that matters to this discussion, because it was a kind of a universal aspect of Aristotelian thought that he applies to this question of the politics, and it links back to this question of the pragmatism. How can we define what something is? For Aristotle, it was his so-called theory of causes, which is that we can reduce all things to four basic questions. We can answer these basic questions, we can actually define what something is worth. I mentioned it briefly in passing last time about the notion of Aristotelian essentialism. And you may recall that essentialism is what makes something what it is, the essence of something. And so in the case of human beings, it's not the fact that we have certain organs or eyes or ears or whatever. The essence of the human being is our capacity for logos. This is what distinguishes us from other animals. In order to arrive at that question of what is the essence, then, Aristotle had this method that he used to try and talk about things that apply as much to, say, physical objects as to abstract concepts like the theater or the state. So the theory of causes is there are four things that you need to ask. You need to ask, what is something made of, which is called the material cause. You need to ask, why does it take the shape that it does? So what is it made of? Why does it take the shape that it does? Why does it look the way it does? So the so-called formal cause. Why does it behave the way it does? Another way of saying that is what makes it move, but we might say what explains its behavior or its interaction? That's the efficient cause. And then finally, the final cause, which is what is it for? What's it there to do? We can apply this rule set then to Aristotle's discussion of the state. And you'll see actually as we go through our discussion that in fact a lot of how he thinks about the state is guided then a little bit by these criteria specifically. Interestingly, as you recall, he starts the book not with the material, nor the formal, nor the efficient, but he starts the book with the discussion of the final cause of the state. What was the final cause of the state? What is the state there to do? What is it there for? It is there to allow the individual to live a flourishing life, the so-called eudaimonia, the good spirits that we seek in our lives. And so the point of the state, a well-constituted state, is a state then that permits the citizen to achieve her eudaimonia. Or except in Aristotle's case, it would almost certainly be his eudaimonia. So in a sense, Aristotle starts the discussion not as one might with, say, a kind of scientific inquiry, like a rock, but instead he starts it not on the level of science, but on the level of the arts. We know what it's there for. The way we might say, music is there to please our senses. So we know what it is that we want from it. The question is, how do we get it? And the way then we have to think about how we get it is we then have to build backwards and think about these other questions. In order for us to achieve the state as it should be, in order to get what it is that we want, how do we think about what it's made of, what shape it takes, how it behaves, and if we can think about all that in the right way, then we can somehow clarify this question of how we constitute it in order that it may deliver its final cause. As we will see, because we can start with this last cause, the idea that the state is there to provide this outcome, the result is that Aristotle, although this is a treatise about pragmatic politics, nonetheless, there is a normative element to it. And so we might say that the Politics lays out, particularly in books 4 and 5, normative political vision. What should politics be? Here's politics as it is practiced. How can we use those examples of the world around us to then think about how politics should be practiced? If we talk about normative, what we're really saying is the way something should be done, right? So a normative claim is a claim on how something should be done. So all that to say, what we'll find as we go through our discussion today, that the purpose of this, right, in order to get to the final cause reflects the state not as it is, because some states don't allow citizens to lead a good life. Therefore, it forces us to think about the state as it should be. Not in a utopian sense, not in a state that can't actually be constructed, but in a pragmatic sense. How do we then construct the states around us to allow us to live a good life, allow us to live a life of human flourishing? And the way we answer that question then leads to these normative conclusions. This is what we should do, this is what we should not do, and here are the reasons why, because ultimately they disrupt or prevent or impede the realization of the final cause of the state. The one other thing I will mention quickly in our review of Book 1 is that you may also recall that he emphasized this principle of moderation, which will be important to our discussion going forward, particularly in the context of the household acquisition of property. He talks about the art of acquisition, neither too much nor too little, that the principle of moderation is an important skill to possess, to nurture, in the acquisition of property. And he mentions this at the beginning as essentially one of those features of political behavior that is realized not in the context of a state, but in the context of the household. It's at the most basic unit, these kinds of politics that then surround us as a result of the relationships that we have, that he embeds then this principle of moderation. So by the time we get to the end of Book 1, what have we observed? What have we learned of ourselves? We've learned that we are political animals. We've learned that as political animals, we must be in some kind of a state, that the most basic unit of the state is the household, and that within the household are incorporated all these different kinds of modes of political behavior and action: monarchy, constitutionalism, and moderation. That's what we get by the end of Book 1. We then also looked at Book 2, in which I think we can see Aristotelian pragmatism in practice, because having laid out these basic principles in Book 2, he then proceeds to consider different modes of political organization and existing political models, and offers a critique of them. And perhaps the most sustained critique that he offers in Book 2 is against the model proposed by his former teacher, Plato. And as we discussed last time, he is not particularly sympathetic to the vision of Socrates as laid out in the Republic. He doesn't agree with many of the principles that Socrates embeds in their ideal city, in their Callipolis, the beautiful city. Yes?
But, he writes very weird Aristotle in my point of view.
That's not a question.
And the thing is that he says that people are self-sufficient, so they're less united or something like that. I don't understand that part.
Well, what he says is that the city needs certain elements within it in order to exist. A city can't just be made up of one group of people or another group of people, because we have all these different needs. Remember that the premise is we are not self-sufficient. You can neither grow all the food you need, nor build all the instruments or tools that you need, nor cure yourself, and so on. So as a result, the individual, in order to lead a life, really any kind of life, even just to survive, let alone one that aspires to human flourishing, requires then the contribution and participation of others. If you don't grow your own food, what are you going to need? Some relationship with someone who does. So the city, as simply an expansion of the principle of non-self-sufficiency inside the household, then requires all these different people to be participant. Those people are obviously going to be very different. What you do is going to affect who you are. So you can't find unity simply in the kinds of people that you bring together, because you're going to need to bring together lots of different kinds of people. So therefore, you have to think about unity at another level, and that's why he talks about the importance of education. Education provides a unity that no city can aspire to create otherwise. You can't just have a city made up of farmers. You can't just have a city made up of people who make, I don't know, buckets or something. You need all these different skill sets and functions inside the city. Therefore, you have to look for unity elsewhere. And the point about the Republic is it doesn't have a blueprint. What it says is the unity of the Republic will come from the fact that everyone's going to recognize that the guardians are such good people that we must all listen to what they say. For Aristotle, that's not very practicable. That's not realistic. There's going to be a better way. So if you're looking to actually construct a politics, you should construct a politics based on what you can actually achieve, not on some kind of utopian vision based on a Platonic ideal of abstracted justice and recognition as such. We also saw that in the second book, he also considers beyond merely condemning things or rejecting things like the communalism of the Republic, what he thinks of its absurd family policies and the like. We also saw that he considers real-world examples. He looks at Sparta, and I should note that, by the way, that you'll often see the phrase the Lacedaemonia or Lacedaemonian, which is simply another word for Sparta in the text. So he talks about, for example, Sparta. He says, for instance, at 1270a, lines 15, 16, and so on, he talks about, for example, the inequality of property. He says that in the city of Sparta there are few who own much and many who own very little. And this inequality of property is a problem, and he attributes it not to historical circumstance, but what he calls faulty laws. That is a problem of the laws that govern the state. So when you see, in other words, some problem in your society, for example, the inequality of property, this is something that can be corrected by improving your laws. This is the point of the pragmatic politics. If there's something wrong, you don't have to just accept it as such. What you do is you then can make it better by practicing a better politics. So essentially, the mandate of Book 2 is to lay out why we need to acquire a pragmatic point of view about politics, because if we can learn to practice a better politics, we can put it into action, and then we can make a better life for people. Aristotle will eventually take us to a place where he lays out his case for what is the perfect state. The difference is that unlike the Callipolis, the perfect state, the ideal city that the Republic lays out, Aristotle's perfect city is not utopian, at least not in his view. His perfect city can be realized. The way you get to it is you think about the material, formal, efficient causes of what that state should be in order to understand then how you get there. Now, I should note, the material cause is not particularly interesting, because what is the material cause of a state? A state is made up of who? Are slaves part of the state? Citizens. So the material cause are the citizens who live inside the state. And it's interesting that at the start of Book 3, he puts into play this question of the material and the formal. What is it made of, and what shape does the city take? And those two elements hinge around the question of the citizen. And so the challenge he lays out at the beginning of Book 3 is, who is the citizen? How do we define the citizen? And then as a subsequent nuancing of that question, he asks a further question, which is the good man a good citizen? Is the good citizen a good man? How do we relate the public role of the individual to their private qualities? And I want to remind you that this word you see frequently, excellence, from the Greek arete, which means what in Greek? Excellence or virtue. So when we talk about the excellence of the citizen, a kind of ambiguous word. What does it mean to have an excellence? It's the idea of the sort of bundle of skill sets, the bundle of qualities together that allow or that define how you act, how you think, how you behave, and the like. The excellence of a doctor is defined by what? For capacity to heal. The excellence of a ship's captain is defined by his ability to steer the ship well and avoid crashing it onto the rock. The excellence of, dare we say it, a university professor is what? To teach properly. Exactly. Lots of people can teach, but not many people can teach properly. So when you see a doctor standing next to a dead patient, or a ship's captain on the bridge of a ship that's foundering on rocks, or a professor presiding over students who've all failed his class, what could you say? That they lack excellence, they lack virtue, they lack arete. So when we talk about the excellence of the individual, the arete of the man, and the arete, or the excellence of the citizen, what we're really asking is, what are those qualities, those elements of the self that contribute on the one side to who you are and the things you do as an individual, versus who you are and the things you do as a citizen. And so right away we've made a very interesting observation. that the individual and the citizen exist as essentially two different entities. I can separate the individual from the citizen, even though it may be the same person. But that means I can examine the nature of the citizen, right, from the nature of the individual, which is why he asked this question. Does a good man have to be a good citizen? Does a good citizen have to be a good man? This is the challenge that we get in Book 3. The reason he's asking this question is if we think about the virtues or the good citizen, the excellence of the good citizen, another way of thinking about that is what is the nature of citizenship? What does it mean to be a citizen? So what's captured by the qualities of being a citizen? And we would capture that with the nature of citizenship. So if the material are the citizens who live inside the city, the form that it takes is defined by the citizenship that is created inside the city. Those are different. A citizen is decided by law. Who shall have the right to participate? We'll come back to that in a moment. Citizenship is defined by the excellence or the virtue of the citizen, right? What kinds of things do you do as a citizen? And so this defines what it's made of, but this then defines what shape it takes, right? This is the formal cause. You can see it, for example, at 1275A and B. The material cause is straightforward. He says, a state is composite. Like any other whole made up of many parts, these are the citizens who compose it. That's the material cause. But the question then of citizenship, as he asks at 1276A, at the end of 1276A, going into 1276B, shall we say that while the race of inhabitants remains the same, the city is also the same? Although the citizens are always dying and being born, as we call rivers and fountains the same, although the water is always flowing away and more coming. So if you imagine a river, right, what makes a river what it is? It's the water flowing through it, and yet every individual droplet of water is constantly rushing through. So it's not the actual water that's occupying the river at any given time, it's the fact that it's a place through which water flows. Shall we say that the generations of men, like water flowing through a river, are the same, but the state changes? For since the state is a partnership, and is a partnership of citizens in a constitution, when the form of the government changes and becomes different, then it may be supposed that the state is no longer the same. The citizens make up the state, but the shape of the state is therefore dependent on what? The kind of government that you have. Different governments create different citizens. So citizenship is then a function of the nature of government. And so when you think about what it is that makes you, as you are, a citizen, what you're actually asking is what kind of government under which you live, right? What are the different forms of government? Because the different forms of government then create the different citizens, and that then gives rise to the formal cause of the state. What's interesting to note there is if we take that idea that the form of government then creates the citizen, we've created a relationship, haven't we? What comes first? The form of government defines then the nature of citizenship. Go back to Book 1. The state is made up of individuals, but what comes before the individual? The state, because the individual can only be an individual in the state. We're not self-sufficient. We must live inside these political communities. It's essentially the same kind of relationship. Your citizenship is going to be determined by the kind of government which elicits it. So your citizenship living in a democracy is going to be different from the kind of citizenship you practice in, say, a tyranny. In a democracy, you might feel free to speak your mind, willing to go out onto the streets, and unlike Socrates, not go home, but in fact do all kinds of other things. Whereas in a tyranny, if you feel that you speak your mind, you might be repressed, executed, or otherwise mistreated. You will not speak your mind. You will, like Socrates, go home. Therefore, your citizenship, the kinds of things that you are willing to do as a citizen, are defined by the kind of government in which you live. Even though the citizen comes before the form of government, the citizenship, the kind of actions that you are permitted, that you permit yourself as a citizen, follow from that. So let's ask then what it is that makes a good citizen. And he gives us some clues in terms of what he sees as comprising the arete, the virtue, the excellence of the citizen. He says the state is a partnership and is a partnership of citizens in a constitution. Therefore, when the government changes and becomes different, it's supposed that the state is no longer the same. The key element there are two words that matter: partnership and constitution. The state is a partnership. Partnership between who? The person who's ruling, right? Some power structure, and you, the citizen, so that you are always some sort of active role in the state. Interestingly, as he points out, if that's not the case, you're not really living in a political society. And then the second point that matters is the question of constitution, and we'll see how important this is to Aristotle, because one of the things that we can argue is that the normative component of Aristotelian politics lies in its constitutionalism. We already discussed constitutions. What was the constitutional relationship that we found in the household? Between a husband and wife, between those who are obeying and those who are commanding. The characteristic then of a constitution is, if we go back to those first principles, that it is a distribution of logos on both sides. So that it is a set of rules amongst people, all of whom have the capacity for persuasive speech, the capacity for reasoned, persuasive speech. So if the nature of citizenship then is defined as a kind of partnership operating under a set of rules designed for people who have the capacity for logos, what is then the desired outcome of that partnership? What should citizens be seeking to achieve? And you'll see that he says the citizen should be looking to what he calls the salvation or the safeguarding of the community. He says one citizen differs from another. We're all different, but the salvation of the community is the common business of them all. Salvation, we might use the word safeguarding. Serving the interests of the community is the common business of them all. This community is the Constitution. The community is the set of rules that you follow, which makes sense because what is the community? A set of relationships. What governs relationships between people with logos? Like a husband and a wife? Rules. You can't just tell somebody what to do. You have to agree on the rules, and so therefore a community is defined by the rules that it embeds within itself. So the safeguarding of the community is the common business of them all, and the community is the Constitution. The excellence of the citizen must therefore be relative to the constitution of which he is a member. If there are many forms of government, it is evident there is not one single excellence of the good citizen, which is perfect excellence, but we say that the good man is he who has one single excellence, which is perfect excellence. Therefore, the good citizen need not of necessity possess the excellence which makes a good man. That is a very confusing statement. You're like, wait, what did he just say? What the fuck? So, what are we saying? If you think about the excellence of the doctor, let's go back to this example. The excellence of the doctor is defined by their capacity to cure the sick. In sum, that is a single excellence. The doctor who can make sick people well, that is a single excellence. The excellence of the citizen, however, is itself determinate. It's not an abstract category. What creates your citizenship? The form of government under which you live. Therefore, if you live under one form of government, you will practice one kind of citizenship. If you live under another form of government, you'll practice a different kind of citizenship. The excellence of the citizen is therefore more variable than the excellence of the man, the excellence of the individual, because of the variability of different types of government. When you first read this, is the excellence of the citizen the same as the excellence of the man? Well, it raises the question, does this mean that we need good people to make good states? Which is sort of the question that Plato suggests. People who cultivate justice well are therefore people who will create states capable of being just. But this seems to suggest differently. It suggests that it's not that we need good people to create good states. We need good states to create good people. You can have excellence of citizenship under a tyranny, but it's not going to be a good thing. You won't be able to speak your mind. You won't be able to prevent injustice or anything like that. Your citizenship will still be good, but it's not the same. So therefore, in this case, what we need to think about, this is again this sort of pragmatic politics, the importance of politics is not that it captures the sort of excellence of the individual and recreates it at the level of the state. The importance of politics is that it has the power to map on to good people a good citizenship. And if you get your politics wrong, it may mean that you're in fact practicing a flawed form of citizenship. And I think we see that today. We see lots of different forms of government, and one of the things we could agree is that some forms of government are much worse than others, and the result is that the people who live under those systems, although fine people they may be, as political actors, they are highly constrained. So the point about the difference between the excellence of the good man and the excellence of the citizenship is that it puts the focus then on what we might call a political imperative, right? It makes it imperative that we get politics right, because if we can't map on good citizenship to the good individual, there's something wrong with our politics. The good news is, as we saw from the discussion in Book 2, bad politics is not simply a fact of life. Bad politics can be made better. How do you make it better? You take Aristotle's class, you listen to what he says, and you apply his principles. That's the purpose of the politics, to learn how to make bad politics better. Hence the importance of the exercise.